Stop! I'll buy that Chinese woman. The mountain man expected a plain bride, but the obese Chinese woman who arrived changed his life. They said he lived like a ghost in the pines, scarred, silent, and savage. Folks called him the Bear of Lost Pass. When he sent for a mail-order bride, they expected someone meek, small, forgettable. What arrived instead was a woman who didn't fit the town's mold, nor his. Wide of frame, wrapped in silks and silent as snowfall, she carried more than just weight. She carried secrets. Why had she come so far to marry a stranger? Why did the mountain man let her stay? And what had they both lost before finding each other? When a mountain heart thaws and an unexpected soul takes root, one truth rises from the smoke. Not all love comes in the shape we expect, and not every stranger is what they seem. Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded that these stories reach far beyond the frontier. If you still believe in honor, redemption, and the power of compassion, then you belong around this fire too. Tell me which state you're watching from, and subscribe to help us keep these stories alive. The mountain man expected a plain bride, but the obese Chinese woman who arrived changed his life. They said he lived like a ghost in the pines, scarred, silent, and savage. Folks called him the Bear of Lost Pass. When he sent for a mail-order bride, they expected someone meek, small, forgettable. What arrived instead was a woman who didn't fit the town's mold, nor his. Wide of frame, wrapped in silks, and silent as snowfall, she carried more than just weight. She carried secrets. Why had she come so far to marry a stranger? Why did the mountain man let her stay? And what had they both lost before finding each other? When a mountain heart thaws and an unexpected soul takes root, one truth rises from the smoke. Not all love comes in the shape we expect, and not every stranger is what they seem. Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded that these stories reach far beyond the frontier. If you still believe in honor, redemption, and the power of compassion, then you belong around this fire too. Tell me which state you're watching from, and subscribe to help us keep these stories alive. They say the Bear of Lost Pass hadn't spoken 10 words to a soul in nearly 4 years. After the accident that took his wife and boy, Gideon Ward vanished up the mountain with a rifle, a dog, and his grief. He built a cabin out of pine logs and sorrow and let the winters bury him. Folks said he'd gone mad, that he talked to ghosts and carved headstones in the snow. Some claimed he shot at travelers who strayed too close. Others said he just wanted to be left alone. Either way, no one went looking for him. No one dared. So when word spread through the hills that Gideon had ridden away for a bride, the whole town leaned in closer. A mail-order bride? For him? The same man who once knocked a man out cold for asking about his dead boy? The same one who hadn't stepped foot in church since the fire? Something didn't add up. The whispers bloomed like sagebrush in the wind. Was she blind? Desperate? Dangerous? And why now? The day she arrived, the platform at Tinker's station fell silent. A rust-stained train hissed steam across the valley as she stepped down. Slow, deliberate, and alone. She wore a dark red robe embroidered with gold peonies, her hair pinned high with ivory sticks. Her face was round, pale, unreadable. Her eyes held something ancient, like moonlight on black water, and her body, full, wide-hipped, foreign, did not match the picture folks carried in their minds of a frontier bride. Children stared. A dog barked. The station master coughed and looked away. In her hand was a worn leather folder, and inside the name Gideon Ward, written in careful ink. She said nothing, not a word, just stood still as the mountains behind her, as if waiting for the ground to shift first. When Gideon came out from the tree line, tall and battered and furrowed like old oak, he did not greet her with a smile. He didn't offer his hand. He looked at her like she was a ghost or a reckoning. The wind caught her robe and flared it out like a flag. She did not flinch. The ride back to the cabin was silent, just hooves in mud, creaking leather, and the occasional snap of a pine branch. She rode in the back of the cart beside her trunk. He didn't look back once. But something in the air had changed. Not loud, not sudden, like the way snow starts to fall before you even notice. Up in the trees, the crows went quiet, and somewhere in Gideon's chest, beneath the scars and silence, a long-forgotten ember stirred. The trunk was heavy, but Mei Lin did not shift her grip. She stood motionless in the heat, her fingers curled tight around the cracked leather handle, the weight of it resting like judgment against her hip. Her other hand clutched the envelope, creased, foreign-smelling, and yellowed from the journey. Inside were the marriage papers, the promise, the lie. The train hissed behind her, a beast exhaling its final breath before retreating down the track, leaving only dust, smoke, and stares in its wake. Men leaned against crates and chewed tobacco. Women shielded their children's eyes. No one offered her help. No one spoke. A little boy pointed and was hushed so quick his neck snapped back. She stood at the center of it all, wide-shouldered and still, her eyes lowered, her silken sleeves brushing the hem of her skirt as the wind tugged at her. The robe she wore had been stitched by her grandmother, a garment meant for weddings, not exile, but this was all she had left that felt like a home. The matchmakers in Hong Kong had painted a different picture. A farmer, they'd said. A quiet man with land, with tools, with a roof. A new beginning. They had not spoken of mountains. They had not mentioned a place where no trees grew straight, where the sky pressed down like stone, where English words sounded like growls and even the soil seemed to reject her. She had been sold. There was no gentler word for it. Sold not for money, but for dignity. Her parents had bowed, ashamed to speak her name. Her sisters had turned their faces, not because she had done wrong, but because her body was wrong, because she had grown round instead of graceful, because she laughed too loudly once, because a man had loved her in secret and left her in silence, because shame in a woman, in their eyes, was not something to heal, it was something to send away. Now she stood under a foreign sun, blinking against its sharpness, feeling every pound of herself under the weight of their gaze. She didn't know the man she was to marry. Gideon Ward, a name scratched onto parchment, paired with her own in looping English script. The letters from the preacher who arranged it had been brief but polite. A good man, it said, sorrowful but hard-working. It said nothing of fear, nothing of the wilderness, nothing of the way the train had climbed and climbed, until even the trees gave up. She wondered if he would be kind. She wondered if he would send her back. A woman with a red bonnet passed by and muttered something sharp under her breath. Mei Lin did not understand the words, but she understood the tone. She always did. The sky was vast above her, stretching in every direction like a challenge. Behind her, the engine coughed and pulled away, its wheels shrieking against the rails. Before her, the dirt road stretched up toward the timbered hills. There was no turning back. She straightened her spine, adjusted the robe, and waited. Not for kindness, not for welcome. Only for the man who had called her here. The mule's hooves beat a slow, deliberate rhythm against the dirt as the cart rolled into view. Just past the edge of town, where the road turned narrow and the trees leaned in. The man guiding it sat hunched, his silhouette sharp against the gray morning mist. His coat was worn, leather stiff from years of rain and blood and bark. His hat sat low, casting a shadow over a face that might have been carved from stone. When he pulled the mule to a halt, he didn't look at her right away. Mei Lin stood still, clutching her papers. Dust swirled around her hem. Gideon Ward, if that was him, climbed down slow. He was taller than she'd imagined, thicker, the kind of man shaped by 1,000 winters, by chopping wood and burying pain. His boots hit the ground with finality. He walked toward her without expression, without welcome. His eyes flicked to the robe she wore, the trunk beside her, the paper in her hand. Then he reached into his coat, pulled out a folded envelope, and handed it to her. His thumb brushed hers in the exchange. It was rough, calloused, alive. "Mail said you'd come yesterday," he said. The voice was low like gravel in a dry creek bed. "Storm up north delayed me." Mei Lin nodded once, not trusting her tongue. He stared for a breath too long, then looked away. "Trunk heavy?" She opened her mouth, unsure if he wanted an answer. He didn't wait for one, just turned, walked to the cart, and climbed back up. She reached for her trunk, dragging it toward the back. He didn't move to help. She hoisted it herself, struggling. The leather scraped the wood. Her breath came short. Finally, it toppled in, landing hard. He grunted. "Tie it down," then flicked the reins. She climbed in beside it, settling into the edge, gripping the slat with one hand. The mule started forward. They didn't go through town. The main road curved past the chapel and general store, past the schoolhouse and butcher's pen, where people would surely be watching. But Gideon turned the cart left, onto a narrow path that ducked beneath pine boughs and tangled roots. Fog clung low. A hawk cried overhead. He didn't speak again for miles. The forest swallowed them. The sounds changed. Less of man, more of earth. Water dripping from leaves. The rustle of something unseen in the brush. She watched his hands on the reins. Strong. Still. He glanced sideways once. She didn't see it, but she felt it. Just a flicker. Curiosity. Doubt. Something passed across his face like the movement of shadow through trees. Quick, unspoken, almost tender. But it vanished just as fast. He pulled his coat tighter and fixed his eyes on the trail ahead. They rode in silence. Mud sucked at the wheels. A fallen branch cracked beneath them. She looked forward and saw only trees. This was not the beginning of a marriage. It was the beginning of a climb. By the time the cart creaked to a halt, the sky had deepened to a cold blue-gray, and the wind carried a bite that clawed through Mei Lin's robe and nestled deep in her bones. Before them stood a crooked cabin pressed up against the slope of the mountain, as if it were leaning into the hill to stay upright. Smoke coughed from a pipe at the roof's peak, but not steadily. It stuttered, as if even the fire inside was hesitant to stay. The trees here grew sparse and crooked, their trunks bent by wind and time. Snow clung to the shaded corners, even though the thaw had begun in the valley below. Mei Lin stepped down from the cart without a word. Gideon opened the door with a grunt and stepped inside, leaving it ajar behind him. She followed, dragging her trunk over the threshold. The interior was dim, lit only by the smoldering remains of a fire and a single oil lamp resting on a crooked shelf. The walls were lined with rough-hewn planks, patched in places with hides and canvas. The roof dipped in one corner, where the beams had bowed under years of storms. A narrow stove hissed in the far corner, but smoke leaked from its seams, curling into the air and stinging her eyes. A table stood uneven near the window, one leg shorter than the others. There were two chairs mismatched. A coat hung from a peg near the door. A single shelf held tin plates, a cracked mug, and a small jar of dried berries. And then, two beds. One clearly his. Larger, its wool blanket worn and matted from years of use. The other, tucked into the opposite wall, looked newly constructed. Just a cot. Flat. Bare. A single folded quilt rested on top. Gideon didn't speak. He pointed to it. Mei Lin nodded. She moved to the cot and set her trunk down beside it. Her hands moved carefully, slowly, as if any sudden movement might splinter the fragile piece between them. She did not unpack. She simply lowered herself onto the edge of the bed and sat. Gideon returned to the stove, opened the door, and shoved in more wood. Sparks hissed. He grabbed a kettle, filled it with snow from a bucket near the door, and placed it atop the stove without looking at her. The silence in the cabin was complete, save for the low whistle of wind pressing against the boards and the occasional pop of sap in the fire. Mei Lin removed her shoes, placed them neatly beneath the cot, and folded her hands in her lap. Her robe shimmered dully in the lamplight, but here, in this space of ash and smoke and worn pine, it looked almost out of place, like silk draped over a coffin. Gideon pulled a stool near the fire and sat, his back to her. The dog, she noticed for the first time, was curled beneath the table, watching her with one wary eye. Neither of them spoke. Outside, the wind howled through the trees like a voice long forgotten. Inside, the silence held. She had come across the world to this place, to this man, and now on the edge of everything, with a roof that moaned and a floor that groaned beneath each footstep, she sat in the dark and listened to the sound of her own breath. She did not cry. She only waited. The days began with frost, even as the sun climbed high. Mei Lin would wake to the sound of Gideon splitting wood outside, the sharp crack of the axe echoing through the trees like a challenge. She would rise in silence, fold her blanket, and begin sweeping the cabin floor with a crude broom of bundled twigs. Dust, pine needles, and wood shavings collected in quiet little piles. She never left them scattered. Gideon said nothing as he moved about his routines. He would come in after chopping, stomp the cold from his boots, and hang his coat by the door without a glance. He'd nod once, never quite at her, just toward her direction, and settle at the table, eating whatever she had placed there without comment. She had found a rhythm without asking. Rice boiled in the mornings from a small sack she had packed herself. Herbs from her bundle simmered in water and steam. Sometimes she would fry small cakes of flour and onion in his iron pan. The cabin, once filled with only smoke and the smell of wet fur, began to carry the scent of ginger, cloves, and something sweeter. Elusive but comforting. He watched her without meaning to, caught himself glancing as she folded the linens that had long been left in a pile by the stove. As she took a patch of leather from the bin and stitched a tear in his coat, slow and precise, she moved without hesitation, like a woman who had once known structure and had not forgotten the way of quiet duty. And she never asked him anything. He waited for her to cry. They all did. The women who came up to these hills, wives, widows, fools. They wept when they saw the crooked beams, the cracked stove, the silence. Some cursed. One had run once down the trail before the first snow. But Mei Lin just worked. In the afternoon, she would kneel by the hearth and pull small pouches from her trunk. Dried roots, curled leaves, powdered stone. She boiled them into teas, spooned them into jars, sealed them with cloth and twine. Gideon didn't ask what they were for, but the dog, usually skittish, began resting near her as she worked. He noticed her hands, not dainty, worn, strong-fingered, as if they had once labored beside someone else. She handled knives with confidence, hauled buckets without complaint, and at night, when the fire dipped low and the wind pressed its cold fingers through the gaps in the logs, she would sit by the flames and hum. Not words, just sound. Soft melodies that curled through the smoke and reached places Gideon thought long buried. The tunes had no beginning, no end. Just little rivers of sound, rising and falling like breath. He never asked about them, but he didn't stop listening either. On the third night, he found himself pausing at the door, hand on the latch, unmoving as her voice drifted through the cracks. For a moment he let his eyes close just to hear it longer. Then he stepped into the cold, into the dark, and let the silence return. But it didn't come back the same. The thaw between them began not with words, but with small, unnoticed offerings. One morning Gideon stepped outside to find a bowl of rice and salted pork waiting on the stump beside his axe. Steam curled from the rim. She hadn't said anything the night before. No instruction, no gesture, just food warm and waiting, as if she'd known the exact moment his stomach would remind him he was still alive. He didn't speak of it, just ate in silence and returned the bowl to the cabin door, rinsed clean in the stream. The next day, the same offering appeared, this time with a sprig of green on top, wild chive or something like it. He didn't know what it meant, only that it made the cold less biting and the silence less hollow. Mei Lin never watched him eat. She would be inside mending seams, scrubbing pans, or sitting quietly at the window with a piece of cloth and a needle in her hands. Her humming had grown softer, almost hesitant, as if she were uncertain whether it still belonged in his home. But he missed it when it stopped. By the fire one evening, she winced while splitting kindling. The blade slipped and her palm opened, a thin, bright slash that welled up fast. Gideon crossed the room before she could hide it. She tried to wrap her sleeve around the wound, but he took her wrist in his rough hand and pulled her toward the light. Her skin was warm and damp with blood. His fingers, thick as rope, trembled as he reached for the jar of alcohol and a strip of linen. She didn't speak, neither did he, but she watched him as he cleaned it, as he pressed the cloth firm and tied the knot, too tight at first, then loosened, gentled, corrected. When he was done, she bowed her head slightly. A thank you without words. He stood there for a moment, watching the way the firelight caught the curve of her cheek. Then he turned away and grabbed his carving knife. The next day, a new stool began to take shape. It started as a block of pine, roughly hewn, set beside the hearth with no explanation. But over the week, he shaved it down in quiet moments between chores, smoothing the edges, adding 4 legs, fitting them with care. By the end of the week, it stood steady beside his own chair. Mei Lin said nothing, but that night she sat in it. The fire crackled between them. The dog dozed at their feet. The room, though still lined with shadows, no longer felt like a cave. On the mantel above the stove, a cracked photograph sat crooked in a broken frame. She had seen it before, but never dared ask. A woman, slim and smiling. A child, maybe 4, holding a pine cone. That night, Gideon reached up, took the frame in his hands and set it on the table between them. The firelight revealed the years faded into the paper. "My wife," he said, voice low, "and my boy." She looked at him gently. He didn't look back, just stared at the photo like it might dissolve. Gone. That was all, no more. He stood, returned the photo to its place, and sat back down, elbows on his knees, face shadowed. Mei Lin didn't press him. She only returned her gaze to the fire, where the coals pulsed red like sleeping hearts. And in the silence that followed, something old and brittle cracked, and let something else begin. The morning sun had burned off most of the fog by the time Mei Lin left the cabin, her woven basket looped over one arm, a small knife tucked into her sash. She said she was going to gather moss and birch bark from the eastern slope, where the rocks stayed wet and green even in late spring. Gideon only nodded. He was chopping firewood by then, but when he heard the door shut behind her, he paused, axe frozen midair, and listened until her footsteps faded into the trees. The silence that followed was sharp and tempting. He glanced at the cabin, at the trunk she kept near her cot. She always kept it locked, but the lock was old. Once he'd caught sight of her opening it with a key tied to a red string. It wasn't a big thing, just a box of personal things, he told himself. But something had lodged in his chest since that night she'd bandaged her own cut without complaint, then quietly stitched up his torn sleeve without a word. He lowered the axe, wiped his hands on his trousers, and stepped inside. The cabin smelled faintly of herbs and ash. Her trunk sat at the foot of the cot, unmoved. He crouched beside it, listening to the wind shift outside. He knew it was wrong, but the questions in his head wouldn't quit. Who was she really? Why had she come to him? Not out of love, He knew better than that. But why this life here, with a man like him? He took the red thread in his calloused fingers and slid the key from its knot. The lock clicked open. Inside, everything was arranged with precise care. Folded garments wrapped in linen, small cloth sachets of dried petals, a comb carved from ivory, and at the bottom, beneath layers of silk, a roll of rice paper tied with gold ribbon. He hesitated, then untied it. It was a painted portrait, inked in delicate brushstrokes. A younger Mei Lin stared out from the scroll, slimmer, her face softer, glowing with something he hadn't seen in her here. Joy. She wore a red dress embroidered with cranes. Beside her stood a tall Western man in a military coat, hand resting on her shoulder. He looked proud, possessive, smiling like he owned the sun. Gideon felt a strange tightness crawl into his throat. He stared at the man's face, the posture, the hand. The scroll had no words, no date, just that image, intimate, undeniable. He rolled it up fast and returned everything exactly as it was, locked the trunk, hung the key back on the red string. By the time Mei Lin returned, cheeks flushed from the cold air, hands stained green from moss, Gideon was outside again, splitting logs with unnecessary force. He didn't look at her. When she set down the basket and moved to hang her coat, he turned away. That night, he didn't eat the bowl of rice she placed near the fire. He didn't sit on the stool she dusted clean. He stared into the flames and kept his back turned. When she hummed, he didn't listen. She noticed, but she said nothing. Later, when he lay in bed, eyes open to the rafters, he heard her voice rise again. Soft, steady, the same tune she always sang. No louder, no weaker. Just the same. Like it didn't matter that he had turned cold. Like she'd known it would happen and chose to sing anyway. The night was colder than the others, sharp enough that the fire cracked and hissed like it was protesting the weight of winter returning. Gideon sat in his usual place, elbows on knees, staring into the flames with his jaw clenched tight. He hadn't spoken much in days, not since the trunk, not since the scroll. And Mei Lin hadn't asked why. She moved like a ghost, careful not to touch his tools, quiet in her steps, still singing, always singing. But tonight, she didn't hum. The silence between them felt heavier than wood smoke. He finally spoke, voice rough and sudden. Who was he? She didn't pretend not to understand. She was sewing a patch on the quilt in her lap, but her fingers paused. Then slowly she set the needle down and looked at him. The firelight made her face seem older, her eyes darker, deeper. My husband, she said simply, an American general, William John Riley. The name tasted bitter to Gideon's ears, though he had no reason to hate it, not really. Still it rang with the weight of uniform pride and polished boots, men who commanded rooms just by entering them. I was not his wife, not by law. Her voice was steady, but her hands tightened in her lap. He found me during a flood. My family had drowned. He gave me a roof, food, paper to draw again. Said I had eyes that saw things people missed. She paused. He kept me, not hidden, but not accepted either. The locals said I was cursed. The army said I was improper. When he died, no one claimed me. Gideon didn't move, but something in his chest shifted, like a frozen branch giving under spring's thaw. The embassy wouldn't help. His children from the first wife came and took everything, even his photograph. She spoke as if it had all happened to someone else, her voice low and distant. I lived 2 years in the room he died in. They called me Ghost Woman. He looked at her fully now, the fire casting long shadows across his face. Why me? He asked, not unkindly. Mei Lin reached for her trunk without opening it, resting her palm atop the lid like it was an altar. His friend, she said, a preacher, from Kentucky, I think. He came once a year, brought books. He wrote letters after General Riley died. I never read them. But one day he said, she swallowed. He said there was a man in America, a man who had lost things too, a man who didn't talk, who lived in the pines. Gideon looked down. He said you built a grave for your son with your own hands. The fire popped loudly. Outside wind curled around the eaves, pressing soft whimpers through the cracks. I did, Gideon said finally. I did. She nodded once, slowly. I did not come to replace anyone, she said, only to survive. He didn't answer, not at first. But when she resumed her sewing, the tension in his shoulders eased. And later, when she began to hum again, he didn't turn away. The storm came in heavy, without warning. Thick clouds rolled over the ridge like an angry tide, swallowing the last of the light and dragging cold, wet wind behind them. The trees bent and groaned under the pressure. Thunder cracked across the valley like the sky had split in two. Mei Lin lit the lanterns early, her fingers steady even as the cabin creaked and trembled beneath each gust. Gideon hadn't come home. He'd left that morning for town, saying only, "Need flour." He hadn't looked her in the eye. She hadn't pressed. That was the way of things between them. Tentative, careful, still healing. Now it was past dusk, and the wind howled like a wounded animal. She placed a second log on the fire and sat on the stool he'd carved for her. The cabin flickered in warm light, but the storm outside pressed in like a threat. The dog paced by the door, ears twitching with each rumble of thunder. Then suddenly, hooves, stumbling, a curse. The thud of a shoulder hitting the wall outside. The door flung open. Gideon lurched in, dripping wet, shirt torn, lip bloodied, and wild in the eyes. The stink of whiskey clung to him like smoke. Rainwater pooled beneath his boots as he staggered across the floor and slammed the door behind him, rattling the lantern glass. Mei Lin stood, but didn't move closer. He didn't speak, just stood there breathing hard, face twisted with something ugly and deep. A bruise bloomed beneath his right eye. His knuckles were raw. He reached for the mantle with shaking hands, as if needing to steady himself, but his grip found the photo frame. With a sudden, violent growl, he hurled it to the floor. The glass shattered. The frame splintered. The image of the woman and boy landed face up among the shards. Mei Lin flinched, but only for a second. Gideon staggered back, slumping against the wall like he'd been shot. His chest rose and fell like a bellows, his eyes unfocused. "They said things," he muttered, "at the saloon, about you." She didn't speak. "They called you bought. Said I ordered a wife same way I'd order boots. Laughed. Laughed at your size, your silence. Called you a thing." His voice broke. His hands curled into fists. "I broke a bottle on one of them. I think I—" He shook his head. "Don't remember." He slid down the wall and landed hard on the floor, legs splayed, body crumpled. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. "I couldn't protect my boy," he rasped. "I didn't get there in time. He burned." His voice cracked. "Now they laugh at her. At you. And I can't." She moved then, quietly, slowly. She knelt beside him, not touching him yet. Her robe rustled like paper in the wind. Her fingers found his face, cradled it gently, carefully, like something broken that might still be mended. His breath hitched, but he didn't pull away. She leaned close, and in her native tongue, barely above a whisper, she murmured, "You are not alone." He looked up at her, eyes wet, mouth trembling, face crumpled under the weight of every buried wound. And something inside him cracked wide open. The tears came, hot and silent. He buried his face in her lap, fists clenched at his sides, shoulders shaking like a child's. She said nothing more, just rested one hand on his head and the other on his back, and let the storm rage outside. Inside, the fire kept burning. The snow melted fast that spring, rushing down the gullies in muddy rivulets, and waking the valley from its long sleep. Birds returned to the pines. The air warmed just enough for breath not to hang like ghosts, and word, like always, moved faster than weather. Whispers spread from the rail station to the church porch, from the saloon to the schoolhouse, not just about the mountain man who'd sent for a bride, but the kind of bride she was. Chinese, big, silent, strange. By the time Gideon rode into town with Mei Lin seated beside him in the cart, her robe replaced with a plain wool cloak, her hands folded in her lap like river stones, every set of eyes turned, and Cyrus Thorne was already waiting. Thorne owned half the valley, by deed or by debt, and aimed to claim the rest before the railroad came through. Gideon's high past was one of the last untouched parcels. No one had the grit to live that far up the ridge but Gideon, and Thorne had never forgiven him for surviving what should have broken him. He leaned against the post outside the general store, thumbs hooked in his belt, slick hat casting a shadow over a grin that never reached his eyes. He waited until Gideon helped Mei Lin down from the cart, until she adjusted the basket in her arms and turned toward the door. "Well now," Thorne said loud enough for all to hear. "Ain't you just a sight? Thought mail order meant the goods were new." The air thickened. Gideon froze. Mei Lin kept her gaze low. Thorne chuckled, stepping forward, eyes glinting. "You trade for her by weight, Ward? Or did they just send you the leftover cargo nobody else wanted?" Gideon didn't speak, didn't warn. He closed the distance in 2 strides, grabbed Thorne by the collar, and slammed him against the post hard enough to shake the nails loose. The street went still. Thorne's boots kicked, hands clawing, but Gideon's forearm was pressed into his throat. "I'll bury you where you stand," Gideon growled, voice thick with a rage that hadn't seen daylight in years. Thorne's face turned red. "Gideon!" came a voice, sharp, commanding. "Sheriff Hale." He crossed the street with a hand on his holster, boots kicking dust. "Let him down." A long breath passed. Then Gideon released his grip. Thorne crumpled to his knees, gasping, coughing. The sheriff stepped between them. "You know better," he said to Gideon. "You lay hands again, I'll have no choice. Jail, you hear?" Gideon stared past him, eyes locked on Thorne, who was already standing, brushing off his coat with slow, deliberate care. "No harm done, Sheriff," Thorne said with a ragged chuckle. "Was just making conversation." He turned to Mei Lin then, gave her a look like he was peeling back skin. "Can't blame a man for being curious." The sheriff stepped closer. "Walk away, Thorne." Thorne did, but not before tossing a final glance at Gideon, the kind that didn't carry fear, but calculation. Later that day in his office above the bank, Cyrus Thorne laid out a map of the ridge. He tapped a black-stained finger against Gideon's parcel. "No need to fight a bear head-on," he muttered. "Not when you can burn the trees around him." And so began the quiet war of paper and lies. The letter arrived in a rain-soaked envelope, delivered by a boy too young to know its weight. He handed it to Mei Lin at the edge of the trail and ran off before she could thank him, his boots splashing in the melted snow. She stood beneath the overhang of the cabin porch, her hands trembling slightly as she turned the envelope over. Her name was written in careful script, half in English, half in Chinese characters that looked like they had been penned with reverence and urgency. She stepped inside, closed the door softly, and sat at the table where the morning light spilled across the wood in soft gold. Gideon was out in the woods gathering rock for a new chimney brace. The fire cracked gently behind her. She opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded sheet, thin, creased from travel. The ink had bled slightly from the rain, but the words remained legible. The letter began in English, stiff and formal. "Mrs. Ward, I pray this reaches you swiftly. I am Reverend Samuel Toller, the man who blessed your union on behalf of the late General Riley. I write with concern and sorrow. There are whispers reaching me from Copper Hollow and the valley beyond. A man named Cyrus Thorne is inquiring into your marriage, your immigration status, and your past associations with the general. I fear he intends to challenge your presence on legal grounds, to claim that your marriage is invalid due to prior moral standing. It is unjust, but not unprecedented. Should he succeed, it could lead to forced deportation or seizure of property. If you and Mr. Ward have record of your marriage and the deed to the land, secure it. Keep it ready. The law is a cold tool, but it can still serve the righteous if wielded carefully. I remain in your corner and in his grace. Reverend Toller. Below the English, a second passage followed, in Mandarin. The strokes were strong, direct. Mei Lin read it again slowly, carefully, as though each word might vanish if she blinked. Her hands dropped to her lap. Deportation. Shame again. Stripped of everything. Again. She rose without hesitation. She began searching. The cabin was small, but Gideon's silence had hidden many corners. She pulled open the drawer by the stove, only old nails and twine. The shelf above the bed held nothing but a hunting knife and a cracked compass. Beneath the floorboards near the hearth, she found a soft spot. She pried it open with her fingers, the wood groaning beneath her weight. There, wrapped in oilcloth and dust, was a tin box. She carried it to the table and unlatched it slowly. Inside lay the deed, signed and sealed, faded but intact. She traced Gideon's name written in large, uneven strokes, the claim to the ridge carved out of the wild and paid in grief. Beside it was a yellowed newspaper clipping. She unfolded it with care. The headline read, "Tragedy on Pine Hollow. Fire claims child's life." Below was a grainy photo of Gideon, younger but already hollow-eyed, holding the charred remains of a toy horse. She pressed her fingers to the paper and closed her eyes. The man who had saved her had once been burned by the same world now seeking to wound her. But she had the deed. She had the truth, and she would not run. The whispers began in the pews, then in the mercantile, then on the walkways between the schoolhouse and the post office. Not loud at first, just flickers of doubt passed hand to hand, like gossip wrapped in scripture. Foreign, some said. Bought, said others. Not right, said most. Cyrus Thorne fanned the flame with practiced ease. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. He simply dropped words like seeds and waited for them to root. At the church steps, he asked if folks were comfortable letting a woman like that near their children. At the general store, he wondered aloud if she had diseases no one could pronounce. At the women's wash line behind the chapel, he told the preacher's wife, "Now, I ain't saying she's dangerous, but think about it. How do we know what kind of life she lived?" The next Sunday, when Mei Lin followed Gideon into town and approached the church doors, the preacher's wife stood firm in front of them, lips tight. "I'm sorry," she said, not meeting Mei Lin's eyes. "There's been discussion. Perhaps it's better if you wait outside today." Gideon stepped forward, but Mei Lin placed a hand on his arm. She didn't speak, didn't need to. Her silence was grace, more eloquent than any sermon. They turned and left together. The dog barked all the way down the lane, as if angered on their behalf. Back at the cabin, the silence settled like frost. But 2 days later, a knock sounded at the door. Sharp, steady. Gideon opened it to find a short, round woman with gray hair tucked beneath a bonnet and hands that looked like they could lift a horse. "Mrs. Hargraves," he said, surprised. "Well, it's certainly not the Queen of England," she grunted. Her eyes flicked past him to where Mei Lin stood near the hearth, dusting the mantle. "Is that her?" Gideon nodded. "She's prettier than I expected," the old woman said. "And you look better than you did 6 winters ago. Less ghost, more man." She stepped inside without asking. Mei Lin turned, bowed slightly, and offered her a chair. Mrs. Hargraves didn't sit. She studied the room, the patched quilts, the clean dishes, the smell of herbs hanging in the warm air. "I delivered your boy Gideon," she said plainly. "Held him in my arms for less than a minute, long enough to hear him cry, long enough to remember." He lowered his head. Then she turned to Mei Lin. "And I remember your kind, girl. My father worked on the rails with men from your land. Called them strong, quiet, loyal to a fault. The white men mocked them until they needed a bridge built over a canyon no one else would cross." Mei Lin said nothing, but her eyes met the old woman's without flinching. "You've got a spine," Mrs. Hargraves said. "I like that." She reached into her coat and pulled out a tin of loose tea. "I host a gathering for the women twice a month. Cards and sass and tea. You'll come next Thursday. I won't take no for an answer. And wear that robe, the one with the red." Then she turned to Gideon. "You best bring her. If you don't, I'll ride up this hill myself and drag her down by the ear." With that, she was gone. The door shut behind her, but something else had opened. And the thaw, quiet but sure, had begun. The snow melted faster than expected that year, slipping down the mountain like memory, soaking the earth until the wildflowers pushed through with quiet defiance. Patches of color bloomed near the edge of the cabin. Golden stars, pale violet tongues, blood-red blooms too stubborn to stay buried. Mei Lin stood in her wool shawl, eyes on the thawing soil beneath the slope behind the cabin. One hand rested on her belly, the other clutching a small pouch of seeds wrapped in cloth. She knelt slowly, dug her fingers into the softened ground, and began planting. Gideon watched her from the porch, arms crossed. He said nothing, but that night he brought down spare boards from the loft and began hammering them into a shape she didn't recognize. 2 days later, the shape became a desk. The wood was rough, but sanded smooth, the legs steady. He set it by the window that faced the slope where she gardened. No words were exchanged when he placed it there. But the next morning, he found her sitting at it, brush in hand, painting slow characters across rice paper with strokes full of peace. That same week, a knock came at the door, high and quick. Not a grown hand. It was Anna Hargraves, the midwife's granddaughter, red-cheeked and clutching a notebook. "She says you can write like dancing," the girl blurted. "Can you show me how?" Mei Lin looked to Gideon. He gave a slow nod. Anna began coming every other day. Mei Lin taught her to hold the brush, how to shape the lines. Strong, then soft. Word spread, as word always does, and by the next week 2 more children came. Then 5. They sat on the porch with slates and chalk, copying strokes, laughing when their hands smudged the lines. And Mei Lin laughed with them. She began baking for them, sweet buns filled with red bean, twisted just right and browned over the hearth. The children took them home, and their mothers, curious at first, asked for the recipe. Then one morning the school teacher waved from across the road. The day after, the blacksmith's wife left a bundle of cloth at the edge of the trail. By spring's full bloom, the stares in town had softened into nods. The whispers had dimmed into silence. Mei Lin's garden sprouted tender shoots, onions, cabbage, a patch of garlic. She knelt over them each morning, humming as she worked. The earth welcomed her gently. Gideon fixed the roof, then carved her name, just the characters, in a plank above the door. She traced them with her fingers and smiled. But the piece wasn't complete. In the shadows of the general store, Thorne watched. From the courthouse steps, he watched. He saw the porch filled with children. He saw the garden grow. He saw Gideon walking taller, straighter, more himself. And Thorne, who had never created a single thing he could not own, clenched his teeth and whispered to no one, "It won't last." But the mountain kept blooming, whether he believed it or not. The letter came on a Tuesday, carried not by a child this time, but by the sheriff himself. Sheriff Hale rode up the trail with dust on his coat and a creased brow that told of long nights and reluctant duty. His horse pawed at the earth as he dismounted, tugging his hat lower over thinning hair. Gideon met him at the edge of the garden, axe still in hand, sleeves rolled to the elbow, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt. Hale didn't speak at first. He looked past Gideon, toward the cabin, where Mei Lin knelt among the sprouting cabbages, her hands covered in soil, her shawl drawn up against the breeze. The sound of her humming carried faintly through the trees. Hale sighed. I didn't want to bring this. Gideon didn't take the envelope. Then don't. The sheriff held it out anyway. Thorne filed a petition with the land board. Says your marriage ain't legal under state code. Claims your property claim's invalid too. Says you never registered it proper with a recognized spouse. He's calling it fraudulent. Gideon's grip on the axe tightened. And, Hale added, lowering his voice, he's got a doctor in his pocket willing to say your wife's presence is a health threat, disease, foreign practices. You know the kind of rot he peddles. I built that cabin, Gideon growled, paid for the land, cut every board myself. I know, Hale said. Doesn't change what Thorne's stirring. Gideon took the letter, tore it open, and scanned the summons. Town Hall, Thursday, hearing before the magistrate. Hale cleared his throat. If you don't show, they'll rule without you. He wants your land, Ward. Wants it bad. Gideon didn't answer. Just turned and walked back toward the cabin, the paper fluttering in his hand like something foul. That night he sat at the hearth, the letter unopened beside him. He stared into the fire, jaw locked, silence thick as smoke. Mei Lin worked by lamplight at her writing desk, the brush gliding softly over the page. She hadn't asked about the sheriff. She always waited, but now she set the brush down and turned to him. You're not going? He didn't look at her. I've seen what Thorne can do in that room. He'll twist words by hands. I've fought his kind before. They don't care about law, only who owns the gavel. A long pause. Then she rose and stood before him, her voice calm but unwavering. I didn't cross oceans to hide. Gideon looked up at her. Really looked. She was smaller than him, quiet and soft-voiced, but she stood like a tree planted deep. Her eyes held no fear, only fire. This land is yours, she said, and now it's mine too. If they want to take it, let them try, but not without our voices in the room. He studied her, saw the woman who had sung to him in the dark, who had taken his broken pieces and made space for them. He nodded once, slow, solid. We go together. And the mountain, listening as always, held its breath. The church hadn't been that full since the last funeral. Wooden pews groaned beneath the weight of neighbors and strangers, boots scuffed the old floorboards, and the air was thick with dust, sweat, and curiosity. Candlelight flickered against the stained glass windows, casting fractured rainbows over men who never smiled and women who whispered behind gloves. At the front, beneath a wooden cross and faded bunting from a war long forgotten, the judge sat stiff-backed with spectacles perched low, his gavel resting like a warning on the pulpit. Cyrus Thorne stood to the side, dressed in black like a crow at harvest, a thick file tucked beneath his arm, and a smirk hidden in the corners of his mouth. Gideon sat in the back pew, broad shoulders rigid, arms crossed over his chest. Mei Lin sat beside him, her robe simple, her hands calm. Her face held no fear, only resolve. The judge called the hearing to order. Thorne strode forward, papers in hand. Your Honor, he began, voice honeyed, we gather here not out of hatred, but concern, legal concern, civic concern. He held up a paper. This here is a copy of the Ward claim, filed improperly, missing the name of a legal spouse, and this, he tapped another page, is a signed affidavit from Dr. Penn stating the woman known as Mei Lin Ward poses a possible health risk, unsanitary practices, foreign illnesses, no official background, No church blessing. Gasps stirred in the pews. Someone whispered, "Is it true?" Thorne turned, voice louder now. She was never his wife. Not legally. This marriage was arranged through questionable means, and if allowed to stand, it sets a dangerous precedent. Property passed to a woman not born on this soil. A man's grief exploited for land and shelter. Gideon's fist clenched, but he didn't rise. The judge cleared his throat. "Is there rebuttal?" Mei Lin stood. She stepped forward, the room parting for her in uncertain silence. Her robe brushed the wooden aisle. When she reached the front, she didn't speak at first. She opened her satchel and drew out 3 items: the scroll painting, the official marriage papers, and a letter. She unrolled the scroll first, holding it high. The painted image of her and the late General Riley shimmered under candlelight. A wave of murmurs rose, confusion mixing with awe. She laid the marriage papers on the table before the judge, then unfolded the letter from Reverend Toller. She began to read, her voice low but unwavering. "I, Samuel Toller, ordained minister of the gospel, do hereby confirm the lawful union of Gideon Ward and Mei Lin, performed under the authority of the state and blessed by my hand. Their marriage stands both in legality and moral truth. Any challenge to this is not rooted in law, but in prejudice." Silence fell. The judge adjusted his glasses. "Do you have anything to add, Mr. Ward?" Gideon stood slowly, the old floorboards creaking under his weight. He walked forward, past the glares, the stares, the men who once feared him. He looked to Mei Lin, then turned to face the crowd. "She came here with nothing," he said. "Not even her name was spoken kindly. She took a broken man, a hollow house, and made both whole again. You think she's a threat? Then I say good. Let her be a threat to every lie we've let sit too long in our hearts." He paused. "I buried a boy once, buried my soul with him. And this woman sang life back into my bones. That's not fraud. That's salvation." The church was still. Even Thorne's smile had vanished. The judge did not bang his gavel. He only said, "I'll need a moment to deliberate." And in that moment, the weight of truth filled the room like fire. The church doors creaked open mid-silence, the groan of their hinges loud as thunder in the stillness. Heads turned, whispers stirred like wind in dry grass, and even the judge looked up from his deliberations. A figure stepped through the threshold, boots heavy with travel dust, long coat damp with morning rain. Reverend Samuel Toller stood tall despite the years in his spine, silver hair tied back, a worn leather satchel slung over one shoulder. He didn't speak at first, just nodded to the judge, then to Gideon and Mei Lin, who both stood still, eyes wide with surprise. The Reverend made his way slowly to the front, his presence cutting through the charged air like a blade through rope. "Your Honor," he said, voice calm and clear, "I apologize for my lateness. I came as soon as I received word of this hearing." The judge adjusted his spectacles. "You have testimony to offer, Reverend?" "I do, and documents to submit." From his satchel, he pulled a small bundle tied with red string. He set it on the pulpit and opened it carefully. Inside, the original copy of the marriage certificate, bearing his signature and state seal. Next, a copy of the land deed with Gideon's name, officially filed, properly witnessed. The union between Mr. Ward and Mei Lin was performed by my hand in accordance with all local and territorial law. It is valid, legal, moral. Thorne, who had risen slowly from his seat, sneered. "You're a preacher, not a lawyer." "I'm also a witness," Toller replied, unshaken. "And I've come with more than a sermon." He reached back into his satchel and retrieved a second stack of papers. "These are sworn statements from 3 men employed by Mr. Thorne. 2 were bribed to falsify documents regarding the health of Mrs. Ward. 1 was pressured to forge an affidavit discrediting the land claim. All have signed confessions under oath, and all will testify if called." The church gasped, a wave of murmurs rippling through the pews. Even the judge's gavel couldn't stifle it. "I also have here a copy of a deed," Toller continued, holding up another sheet, "which Thorne attempted to register with the landlord, transferring Mr. Ward's property into his own name through fraudulent signatures. The ink is still wet." Thorne's face went pale. His mouth opened, then closed. He stepped back, his posture shifting from smug to cornered. "That's a lie," he snapped. "It's all lies." But the judge had already risen. "I've heard enough," he declared. "This hearing finds in favor of Mr. and Mrs. Ward. The land is theirs. The marriage stands." The room erupted. Some cheered. Others wept. The sheriff stepped forward just as Thorne lunged, not at the judge, but toward Mei Lin, venom in his eyes. "You'll regret this," he spat. "All of you. She doesn't belong here. She never will." Before he could take another step, the sheriff grabbed his arm and twisted it behind his back. "That's enough, Thorne." Thorne struggled, hissed, cursed, but no one listened anymore. He was dragged from the church, boots scraping the floor, fury boiling off him like steam from scorched earth. Mei Lin stood still, chin lifted, eyes clear. Gideon reached for her hand. Outside, the town bell rang noon, and something else rang too, quiet but clear. Justice. The boards on the old porch had warped from years of weather and silence. Some split straight down the grain, others rotted soft beneath the weight of time. Gideon pulled them up one by one, tossing them into a growing pile near the stump. His hammer echoed through the valley, not angry like before, but purposeful, measured. Each nail driven was an answer to what had nearly been lost. Mei Lin sat nearby on a stool with a stack of small slates and brushes, surrounded by half a dozen children chattering in a mix of English and broken Mandarin. She corrected their strokes gently, her fingers guiding theirs when they fumbled. The letters they practiced were sometimes American, sometimes Chinese, and sometimes both on the same line. A blending of worlds that didn't seem so strange up here above the trees. One boy brought her a pine cone, saying it looked like a dragon's egg. She laughed, truly laughed, and tucked it into the folds of her apron like treasure. The garden behind the cabin had taken root with wild confidence. Rows of green spilled over their boundaries, flowers curled around stakes, and the sweet scent of early tomato blossoms filled the air. The dog had claimed a patch of shade near the cucumbers and now watched the children with lazy approval. Inside, the cabin was different. Not bigger, not newer, but warmer. A second quilt now covered the bed they shared, stitched together from scraps of Gideon's old shirts and the faded silks from Mei Lin's traveling robes. She'd sewn it quietly one night, her needle moving through cloth as he read aloud from an old brittle book they found in the preacher's wagon, Parables of the Earth and Sky. They spoke more now, not just words about chores or meals, but stories. He told her about his boy, how he'd loved maps, how he'd drawn the stars on the cabin ceiling with charcoal before the fire. She told him of the river near her village, how the fish would leap during the spring festival, how the bells of the city would echo off the tiled rooftops at night. Sometimes they argued about fence posts, about how many children she let into the garden at once, but it always ended in laughter, or in silence that didn't sting. At dusk, they would sit together on the rebuilt porch, his arm around her shoulder, her fingers resting gently on his chest. They didn't always speak. The valley below said enough. Smoke curled from the chimney. The roof no longer leaked. And the cabin, once a tomb, had become something else entirely. A home. One evening, as the sun bled red across the pines, Gideon reached over and took Mei Lin's hand. She didn't startle. She simply leaned her head against his shoulder, eyes soft. "Never thought I'd have all this again," he said. "You didn't," she replied, voice tender. "You made it." And together they watched the day end. On land no longer borrowed, in a life no longer shadowed, beneath a sky that had finally learned how to hold them both. The wind had softened over the years. It still swept down from the high peaks with its chill and voice, but it no longer sounded like morning. It rustled the pines now like old friends sharing secrets, and the porch no longer creaked from neglect but from use. Children's feet, chairs dragged close, Gideon's boots as he moved from woodpile to door and back again. The cabin stood strong, its timbers darkened by seasons and sun, the garden thick with roots and memory. On this particular morning, the sky was wide and blue, stitched with clouds, the air full of promise. Gideon was inside tending to the fire, coaxing warmth from the coals with the ease of someone who no longer rushed the process. The dog, older now and graying around the muzzle, slept nearby, paws twitching in dreams. Mei Lin was kneeling in the garden, her hands deep in the soil, when she heard the call, light and breathless. Mrs. Ward! She looked up to see a boy tearing down the trail, dust flying from his boots, something white clutched in his hand. She rose slowly, wiping her fingers on her apron as he skidded to a halt at the gate. "Letter," he puffed. "For you, all the way from town." She took it gently, nodding her thanks. The boy grinned and darted back the way he came, leaving only the sound of his laughter and the fading crunch of feet on gravel. She stood for a moment, staring at the envelope. The handwriting was careful and looping, familiar, though not from her own time. She stepped onto the porch and sat in the shade, her fingers tracing the ink. To Mrs. Mei Lin Ward. She opened it slowly. Inside was a small note, and pressed between its folds a delicate blue flower, flattened, preserved, a tiny miracle. The scent was faint but still there, like memory caught in paper. She unfolded the note. "Dear Mrs. Ward, you won't remember me, but I remember you. I was small when you taught me how to hold a brush, how to make words sing without raising your voice. You taught me about roots, how some grow in silence but bloom with strength. You showed me that stories could live in gardens and steam buns and lullabies. I just wanted to say, thank you. Your stories taught me who I am. Today we open the schoolhouse below. It's small, but it's ours. I will teach there. The first thing I'll hang on the wall is the character you once painted for me. Hope." With love, Anna Hargraves Mei Lin folded the note with care, pressed the flower between her palms, and smiled. Inside, Gideon stirred the fire, adding a log with quiet hands. When she stepped in, he looked up. "News from the world?" he asked. "Only the good kind," she said. And then, through the open window, drifting faint and proud up the valley's bend, came the sound of the town bell ringing. Not for warning, not for mourning, but for beginnings.